When you think about the ultimate locked room mystery, your mind probably goes straight to, like, a classic detective novel, right?
Oh, absolutely. Like a crime scene, there's no witnesses, the door is bolted from the inside.
Exactly. But for forensic pathologists, the most complex, the most challenging locked room mystery is actually, it's the victim's own body.
Yeah, that is so true.
It's basically a crime scene where the only reliable witness is the tissue and the bone that's left behind.
Right, because unlike a physical room, the human body just cannot be completely scrubbed clean. Like mechanical trauma always leaves a receipt in the anatomy.
Always leaves a receipt. I love that. And today we are taking a deep dive into a stack of forensic medicine texts. We're specifically exploring the exact science of mechanical asphyxia.
Yes, it's fascinating stuff.
It really is. So our mission with this deep dive is to unpack this topic, strangulation and its forensic pathology. We're going to learn how medical examiners, how they basically read the human neck like an organic data drive.
Decoding all those tiny macroscopic and microscopic clues.
Yeah, exactly. The clues left behind by ropes, hands, sticks, and even elbows. And just to set the tone for you listening at home, we're approaching this purely with clinical curiosity.
Right. We aren't here to just dwell on the morbid details.
No, not at all. We're here to really appreciate the incredible, just undeniable puzzle-solving science of forensic pathology. So to start us off, I think the baseline for this entire field requires a very precise definition of what we are actually looking at.
Yeah, definitions are key here. So strangulation, medically speaking, it's a form of asphyxia caused by constricting the neck with a ligature, but, and this is the important part, it's without suspending the body.
Okay, so the constricting force is external. It's not the body's own weight pulling down.
Exactly. The force comes from the outside, not gravity.
Right. So when a medical examiner begins an autopsy on, like, a suspected strangulation case, they're obviously looking for a very specific physical footprint.
They are.
Let's start with the outside. Like, what is the very first indicator on the skin?
Well, the most prominent external sign is obviously going to be the ligature mark itself. So in a strangulation scenario, this mark is typically horizontal or transverse, as we say medically.
Well, transverse, okay.
Yeah, and it usually completely encircles the neck and sits relatively low. Generally, that means below the thyroid cartilage. And because the force is applied dynamically, often there's a struggle.
Right. People fight back.
Exactly. Because of that struggle, the base of this mark is usually quite soft and reddish.
Got it. Now, the texts also paint a really intense picture of the victim's face in these cases. Like, you see a face that is puffy, deeply cyanotic, so it's blue, with eyes that often bulge.
Yeah, dilated pupils, a swollen, protruding tongue. It's very distinct.
You even see blood leaking from the nose and ears.
Yeah, you do, yeah. And that intense facial presentation, it really all comes down to the mechanics of blood flow, which that actually explains a critical forensic indicator called petechial hemorrhages.
Or Tardieu Spots, I think the text called them.
Yes, Tardieu Spots. So here's what happens. When a ligature compresses the neck, it very easily collapses the jugular veins.
Because they're closer to the surface.
Exactly. Those veins are superficial, they have thin walls, so they just shut down quickly, which completely stops the blood from draining out of the head.
Okay, that makes sense.
But the deeper vessels, the carotid and vertebral arteries, they have these thick, muscular walls.
Oh, so they don't collapse as easily.
Right. They require much, much more force to close.
So basically, the deep arteries just keep pumping blood up into the head, but the exit routes are completely blocked off.
Exactly. It creates this massive vascular traffic jam. The venous pressure in the head just skyrockets. And eventually, the tiny thin-walled capillaries in lax tissue.
Like the eyelids and stuff.
Yeah, the eyelids, the face, the conjunctivae, the eyes, they simply over-distend and pop.
Oh, wow.
And that leaves these tiny pinpoint blood spots. You'll mostly find them adjacent to the ligature mark and anywhere above the level of obstruction.
So the body is physically drawing a map of where that pressure line was applied. That is incredible.
It really is. But, the surface only tells half the story.
Right, because when examiners look internally, the sources point out that there is severe engorgement and hemorrhage in the tissues, specifically above that compression line.
Yeah, the internal examination reveals the true violence of the event. The muscles running vertically down the front of the neck, which are known as the strap muscles, they are usually lacerated or just deeply bruised.
And you'll often find internal bleeding in the thyroid gland too, right?
You will. But interestingly, those deep carotid arteries we mentioned earlier, they're usually completely intact.
Wait, really? even after a strangulation.
Yeah, a typical ligature just doesn't tear the deep arteries in a strangulation unless massive, overwhelming force was used.
Wow, okay. Now, I want to look at something the texts call pseudo-strangulation, because this sounds like a false positive that could just completely derail an investigation.
Oh, it's a major trap for medical examiners.
Like, for example, the sources say a tight shirt collar on a decomposing body can literally mimic a murder weapon.
It happens. As a body decomposes, the tissues just naturally swell.
Right.
So if the person died of natural causes, but they were wearing a buttoned shirt or a really tight collar, that swelling flesh pushes outward against the unyielding fabric.
So the fabric cuts into the skin.
Well, over time, it creates this deep, dark groove in the skin that looks remarkably like a horizontal ligature mark. You actually also see this in infants or short-necked adults.
Where natural skin folds just get compressed post-mortem.
Exactly.
Okay, let's unpack this. If the visual marks on the skin look identical to the naked eye, how does an examiner prove it's just a skin fold and not an actual attack?
This is where the internal autopsy becomes the ultimate lie detector. If it's a pseudo-ligature mark, so just a skin fold or a collar impression, when the examiner dissects the neck, the underlying tissues will be completely pristine.
So no damage underneath?
Right. There is no hemorrhage, no bruising in the deep muscles, no trauma to the glands. It is purely a surface impression caused by passive swelling.
Whereas a real attack would show damage.
Exactly. If it were a true strangulation, the mechanical kinetic energy of the attack would leave extensive tearing and bleeding in the tissues right beneath that groove.
The internal tissue records the kinetic energy.
Oh.
That makes perfect sense. Okay, so we've established what a true ligature strangulation looks like. But forensic pathologists frequently deal with staged scenes, right?
Very frequently, yes.
Like an assailant might try to cover up a strangulation by staging it as a suicide by hanging. How do the experts distinguish between the two?
It really comes down to analyzing gravity versus applied force. So let's look back at the ligature mark. We noted that in strangulation, the mark is horizontal, it's lower on the neck, and it has a soft, reddish base.
Right.
In hanging, the physics change entirely. The body's weight is pulling down, so the mark is oblique.
Meaning it slants upward toward the knot.
Yes, exactly. It's usually high up on the neck, above the thyroid cartilage. And because the tension of a hanging body is so extreme and constant, the skin at the base of the mark becomes hard.
Like parchment almost.
Yeah, pale and parchment-like, because of the friction and the sheer sustained pressure.
Okay, I noticed the texts emphasize abrasions and muscle bruising for strangulation, but they note it's actually quite rare in hanging.
It is rare, yeah.
Which is wild to me. Since both involve a rope violently compressing the neck, why doesn't a hanging victim have extensive friction burns?
Well, think about it. In strangulation, you have a dynamic struggle. The victim is fighting the ligature, they're fighting the assailant, twisting their neck around.
So the rope is basically skidding and scraping across the skin.
Exactly, leaving all those friction abrasions. But in a hanging, the sheer weight of the body usually locks the ligature into place almost instantly.
Oh, so it just bites in and stays put.
Right, there is no lateral sliding of the rope, so you just don't get that widespread superficial scraping.
That is fascinating. But I want to push back a bit on the physiological reactions the sources describe, because on the surface, it almost seems contradictory.
Okay, what do you mean?
Well, both hanging and strangulation ultimately cut off oxygen to the brain. Yet the texts say a hanging victim typically has a very pale face, while we just established a strangulation victim looks deeply cyanotic and blue.
Right.
Why is there such a drastic difference in the facial presentation?
It goes right back to that vascular traffic jam we discussed earlier, but scaled up by the sheer magnitude of force.
Okay.
In a typical complete hanging, the constricting force is the entire weight of the human body dropping.
That's a lot of kinetic energy.
It's massive, and it completely and instantly crushes all the vessels in the neck simultaneously. The superficial jugular veins and the deeper, thicker carotid and vertebral arteries.
Oh, because the drop force is so high.
Exactly. The entire plumbing system is shut down in a millisecond. No blood goes in, no blood comes out, so the face remains pale.
Because the pump to the head is just entirely shut off from the jump.
Yes. But in strangulation, the force is just the strength of the assailant's arms pulling a cord.
Which is a lot, but it's not a whole body weight.
Right. It's enough to collapse the superficial veins, trapping blood in the head, but it's usually not enough to stop the deep arteries from pumping more blood in.
Hence the intense cyanosis, the bursting capillaries, and the bleeding from the mouth.
Exactly.
The sources also point to saliva as a really critical differentiator between the two.
Yes, saliva is a hallmark. In hanging, the extreme upward pressure of the ligature forces the jaw open, and it directly stimulates the salivary glands.
Since they're hanging vertically.
Gravity causes that stimulated saliva to trickle straight down the chin and chest. It leaves a very distinct visible trail.
Wow.
But in a strangulation, the victim is usually horizontal, they're fighting, and the pressure dynamics are totally different. You simply don't see that characteristic downward trickle of saliva.
Okay, that makes a ton of sense. So we've talked entirely about static ligatures so far, ropes or cords that lock into place. But human hands are dynamic.
Very dynamic.
How does a medical examiner read the chaos of a moving, gripping hand? Which I guess brings us to manual strangulation or throttling.
Yes, throttling. It's defined specifically as asphyxia produced by compression of the neck by human hands. And there is a really crucial biomechanical reality here that counters a lot of common assumptions.
What's that?
When people think of throttling, they just naturally assume the cause of death is the airway being crushed shut, blocking the windpipe.
Right, they assume the person just can't breathe air.
But the fatal mechanism is actually the occlusion of the carotid arteries.
Wow. Okay, so the pressure on the arteries stops the oxygenated blood from reaching the brain, leading to cerebral hypoxia.
Exactly.
The airway blockage is almost secondary.
It is. The force required to collapse the rigid airway is actually much higher than the force required to collapse the carotids. And because hands are the weapon, they leave a highly specific, very localized signature.
Because of the fingers.
Right. Examiners look for oval or round finger marks on the skin, and the placement of these bruises literally reconstructs the attacker's grip.
That's wild. Like, how specific does it get?
Well, if an assailant uses a right-handed frontal grip, they will leave a single distinct thumb impression on the right side of the victim's neck, usually right under the lower jaw.
And the fingers are on the other side?
Yep. On the left side of the neck, you'll find a clustered line of several finger marks sloping obliquely downward.
The sources outline fingernail marks as well, which are usually crescent shape, but the mechanics behind how they form can leave an inverted crescent.
Yeah, the inverted crescent is fascinating because it reveals the physics of the struggle.
How does that happen?
During a violent struggle, an assailant's fingernails will dig deeply into the victim's skin, right? They act almost like anchor points.
So they're locked in.
Right. But when the victim twists or the attacker's hand slips from sweat or motion, the skin tears slightly against that static nail tip.
Oh, I see.
So the resulting mark is an inverted crescent with the curve actually facing toward the finger pad rather than away from it. It maps the exact direction of the slip.
Oh, so you can tell exactly which way their hand jerked.
Exactly. You also look for the victim's own fingernail marks on their neck left by desperate attempts to pry the attacker's hands away.
Man, the internal trauma from throttling sounds devastating. The sources describe extensive muscle bruising and fractures of the larynx and the thyroid cartilage.
It's severe, yes.
But they single out one specific piece of cartilage, the cricoid cartilage. It's a complete ring of cartilage lower down in the neck. And the text says it's almost exclusively fractured and throttling rather than ligature strangulation.
The anatomy dictates the injury here. A rope or a cord is narrow, right?
Right.
And during a struggle, it typically rides up the neck, slipping above that cricoid ring. But a human hand is broad.
Oh, so it covers a larger area.
Yes. The crushing wide grip of an adult hand encompasses the entire lower neck. It puts direct lateral pressure on that specific cartilage ring until it just snaps.
That brings up the bones themselves, actually. The texts dive really deep into the hyoid bone, which sits right at the base of the tongue.
The hyoid is a crucial piece of forensic evidence.
It's this small U-shaped bone. Wait, if it's U-shaped and sits horizontally in the neck, it functions almost like the wishbone in a bird, doesn't it?
That is a very accurate biomechanical comparison, actually. The hyoid bone naturally hardens and calcifies as a person ages, particularly after age 40.
Making it much more brittle.
Exactly, making it highly prone to fracture under pressure.
So just by looking at which direction this wishbone snapped, you can instantly deduce the weapon used.
You can. The fracture pattern is incredibly reliable. In manual throttling, the hands squeeze the neck from the sides, pushing inward toward the spine.
Okay.
That kinetic force drives the greater horns of the hyoid bone inward, snapping them toward each other.
It's squeezing the wishbone from the outside until it breaks right in the center.
Yes, exactly like that. But in hanging, the ligature is pulling upward and backward, digging into the angle of the jaw.
So it's pulling the bone apart.
Right. The rope forces the hyoid bone backward, which causes the two horns to spread apart and diverge. It snaps them outward.
Wow.
So an inward fracture indicates the lateral compression of hands. An outward fracture indicates the upward tension of a rope.
So the skeletal system itself basically becomes a binary code for the investigation. Hand or rope, inward or outward.
Beautifully put, yes.
But hands and ropes aren't the only weapons out there.
Ah.
The sources detail several unique variations of violence that leave highly localized signatures.
They do, and these are important to recognize.
Let's look at palmar strangulation first.
Right. So palmar strangulation bypasses the gripping action entirely.
How does that work?
The assailant places the flat palm of one hand horizontally across the victim's mouth and nose. Then they use the heel of their other hand to press brutally into the front of the neck.
So there's no squeezing.
Mm-hmm.
Why does this leave diffuse bruising instead of the distinct localized marks we see in throttling?
It's just basic physics regarding surface area. Fingertips act almost like stilettos, right? They concentrate all the kinetic energy into small, focal, oval bruises.
Because the force is over a tiny area.
Exactly. But the broad, flat heel of a hand acts more like a sledgehammer. It disperses that kinetic energy over a much wider surface area.
Oh, I see.
This masks the focal point of the trauma externally, leaving a wide, indistinct bruise. But internally, it's still delivering enough crushing force to completely fracture the thyroid cartilage.
A sledgehammer versus a stiletto. That's a great analogy. We also need to look at cases where a ligature is used, but it's clearly not a suicide. What homicidal indicators are pathologists looking for in the binding itself?
Well, the knot is the primary witness here. Suicides typically utilize a simple slip knot or a half knot.
Something easy to tie.
Right, something that can be tied quickly and mostly relies on gravity to tighten as the body drops.
Right.
But when an examiner finds a cord wrapped several times around the neck and it's secured with multiple complex knots.
Like what kind of knots?
Specifically reef knots or granny knots that are tied independently on separate turns. When you see that, it changes the entire narrative.
Because a person can't really tie that on themselves effectively.
Exactly. The complexity, the firmness, and the specific mechanics required to tie those knots strongly indicate a second person was standing over the victim, physically securing the bind.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, the text mentions a specific method called mugging, which in this forensic context refers to a chokehold using the bend of the elbow from behind.
Yes, the mugging hold.
The sources note that this method leaves almost no external marks on the skin. Maybe like a slight abrasion on the jaw from friction.
Often there's nothing on the surface at all.
So if the skin shows no trauma, how does a forensic pathologist catch an elbow chokehold? I mean, how do you not miss it entirely?
It's about knowing how tissues react. The broad surface of a closed forearm or bicep doesn't bite into the epidermis the way a narrow rope or a rigid fingernail does.
Right, it's too soft.
And the skin is highly elastic. It can stretch and bounce back without leaving a bruise on the surface. But the deep internal tissues, they cannot absorb that displacement.
Another terror.
Exactly. When the medical examiner dissects the neck, they will find massive, diffuse hemorrhage deep within the strap muscles and behind the larynx. The soft, vascular tissues surrounding the airway essentially absorb the entirety of that crushing force.
Wow, so the external skin basically acts like a bumper, but the engine underneath is completely destroyed.
That's a perfect way to describe it.
The texts also cover a couple of specific cultural or historical methods. There is Bansdola, which involves the use of sticks or bamboo.
Yes. The physics of Bansdola create a very rigid focal injury. If an assailant presses a single stick forcefully across the windpipe, it doesn't leave a uniform or a diffuse bruise.
Because the object is completely rigid.
Right. It leaves a very distinct horizontal central band of bruising that corresponds exactly to the width and shape of the wood. It just crushes the trachea directly backward.
And if they use two sticks?
If two sticks are used, so one across the front and one behind the neck, pressed together, you get mirroring, highly geometric marks on both sides.
Wow. And finally, let's touch on garroting.
Garroting is a specialized attack from behind. It utilizes a U-shaped ligature, often a rigid wire, cord, or even a modified collar.
Like in the movies.
Basically, yeah. The assailant throws it over the victim's head and pulls it sharply backward against the front and sides of the neck.
Did that leave a normal ligature mark?
Actually, no. Because the tension is pulling directly backward from a fixed point behind the victim, the ligature mark often doesn't encircle the back of the neck at all.
Oh, because it's being pulled away from the back of the neck.
Exactly. But the anterior crushing force on the larynx and the carotid arteries in the front is immense, it's highly focal, and it is instantly incapacitating.
The mechanics of all these methods are heavy, obviously.
Yeah.
But the science behind decoding them is honestly just brilliant.
It really is an incredible field of study.
Which brings us back to you, the listener. Why does understanding the biomechanics of hyoid bone fractures, or the vascular traffic jams causing Tardieu spots, or the physics of pulmar energy dispersion actually matter?
Because it proves that the human body is the ultimate, unerasable data drive.
Yes. No matter how meticulously a crime scene is staged, no matter if an assailant tries to mask a violent throttling by stringing up a rope afterward, the internal tissues, the calcified bones, and the deep blood vessels, they all record the exact kinetic energy of what actually happened.
The anatomy always tells the truth of its own destruction.
It teaches us the profound value of looking past the obvious surface, like literally dissecting past the skin to find the mechanical, undeniable truth underneath.
Exactly. Forensic pathology is simply the language developed to translate that truth. By understanding the physics of trauma, medical examiners ensure that the physical reality of the event just cannot be silenced by a staged room.
Which leaves me with a final, provocative thought for you to ponder. We've talked exclusively today about the gross physical marks left on the cartilage, the deep muscles, and the vascular system, right? The macroscopic evidence of kinetic energy.
Right, things we can see with the eye or a standard microscope.
Exactly. But as forensic science continues to advance into the microscopic realm, what chemical distress signals might the cells themselves leave behind in those final moments of oxygen deprivation?
Oh, that is a huge area of emerging research.
Right. Like, could we one day bypass the physical bruising entirely and literally read the sequence of a locked room mystery just by decoding the victim's cellular memory?
Mapping the chemical biomarkers of hypoxia at the cellular level is a frontier that could completely redefine how we interpret trauma in the future.
It is definitely something to mull over. Thank you so much for bringing this incredible source material to the table. And to you listening, until next time, keep looking past the surface.